morning, and thank you for joining us today for our November HR Forum. For those of you who haven't been with us before, my name is Paul Burton, and I'm head of the employment team here at Threatons. And I'm joined today by my colleague Chris Dobbs, and he's been with us since November 2019. So he's had to be with us through the pandemic, and he's going to be assisting me today with our topic. Which basically is going to be, first of all, Chris is going to go through the menopause and the discrimination elements around that. And then I'm going to look at long COVID and some general sickness absence good tips. Over to you, Chris.
Great, thanks, Paul. Morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us again. So we thought a helpful starting point today would be to revisit our definition of a disability, as both the menopause and long COVID, when Paul gets there, are going to have disability questions around them. In our face-to-face session last time, we were split into two groups, as those of you who were with us will know, and both groups explored a case that looked at the definition of disability. In fact, all four cases ultimately did. Both were, the ones I'm thinking about, were really exploring the point at which someone is disabled and meets this test under Section 6. So for those of us who were with us in September, this is a quick recap. For those of you who weren't, well, actually, hopefully this is still just a recap. The structure that I've got on the screen here is how I remember it. It incorporates some of the statutory language where that's particularly significant and important, but also some of my own wording, just to make sure that we're looking at it for the actual criteria as it's treated in the tribunal at the moment. So of course, we know we're looking for a physical or mental. Bear in mind that mental health conditions are capable of meeting this test impairment. That doesn't necessarily have to be a named or diagnosed medical condition. It just has to be an impairment of some kind, which otherwise satisfies the test. I'm a huge fan of using hyperbole examples. Missing a leg is not necessarily, strictly speaking, going to be a named medical diagnosed condition, but it is clearly an impairment. That impairment then needs to have a substantial. I think those of you who were with me last time we looked at that definition. Section 212 of the Equality Act, people tend to ignore definition sections. And what it says there is that substantial means more than minor or trivial. It's a good way below what our everyday use of the word substantial is. So we're looking for a more than minor or trivial. And long term, which I think was Paul's group last time, talking about 12 months or more, either actually 12 months or more, or that it was likely to be at the date of the alleged act. So a physical or mental impairment, which is more than minor or trivial, has or is likely to last more than 12 months, or of course is a terminal condition, which, final point on the slide, has an adverse effect on the claimant's ability to carry out day-to-day activities. And again, those of you who were with me last time, we looked at the autistic gentleman and the case there with the EAT said that the original tribunal was wrong when they were testing something that a lot of people struggle with and saying therefore it couldn't be a disability. That's not the case. That's the test for discrimination when you're comparing somebody to somebody else. The test for the definition of a disability is the impact on the individual. Forget everybody else. Only a very, very quick recap of the definition because it's important for today. Keep that in mind because I think it's going to be useful when we're talking about the menopause and long COVID in the rest of the session. Okay, so the menopause itself, the bit that we're all really excited to talk about. Firstly, my session was always going to be quite interactive. I had planned a lot of this when I thought we were still going to be in person. And even though we've come online, I do want to try and keep it that way. So throughout this, I'm going to be asking questions. I'm going to be throwing back to you a little bit. So please do turn your camera on and wave at me, raise a hand, share your ideas in the chat, whatever, because it will help a lot. I can't see everybody because I'm screen sharing, but as Paul said, he'll keep an eye as we go along. And again, I can half see the chat where I'm screen sharing. So, is that already a hand raised, Ellen? Is that just it's checking it's working?
Ellen, yeah.
That's great. Yeah, it's definitely working. Okay, so my first question for all of you then, again, feel free to stick it in the chat to come on to wave to talk to us. Why? apart from the fact that you wanted to make a slightly awkward conversation for two men to talk to a group of largely women about the menopause, why did you want us to talk about this now? Perhaps more importantly, why? Women haven't only just started going through the menopause. As far as I'm aware, it's not something new in the last 6 months. So why is it that we're talking about this in November 2021 all of a sudden? I mean, 6 people put it down last time as something to talk about. Throwing it straight back to you, why did you want us to talk about it? Dare somebody to chip in, otherwise I'm going to make Paul give an answer.
Oh, hello.
Paula, hi.
Sorry, I
Hi,
didn't know.
Paula.
I didn't know. Morning. I didn't know where the raised hand function was. I think for us at Lush, it's just become. I think in the last 4 years, it just seems to be a word that people are actually starting to talk about instead of like it being such a taboo subject. Because obviously, you're quite right in what you say. Like it's impacted people for years, but nobody's really spoken about it. And I think I was actually one of the people that asked for us to talk about it because, you know, it is protected, isn't it? Under like age and is it age and disability?
Yeah,
right?
I mean, we'll come on to a full look through, but yeah, age, sex, disability, yeah.
Yeah, so we just want to make sure that we're supporting our staff, and we're actually doing like a big push on it at the moment. So that is why I just thought it'd be good to hear like the kind of legal side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple of comments through in the chat that I know everybody can see as well, sort of on the same vein, really. Issues at the moment being cited as mitigation in a disciplinary case. That's an interesting one.
Well,
yeah,
Chris, you've got at least one. Is it 2?
I do. Yeah, I've got one ongoing case with it at the moment.
Yeah,
I'll refer to briefly later in the session. So yeah, okay. So yeah, we want to talk about it because it's, I suppose, as we say, it's because it's something that is starting to become increasingly high profile. Okay, so let's take one step back from that. Why are people suddenly talking about it?
I think, well, just me chipping in here. I think what Claire's put in there, I think, yeah, it is driven by the press as well, the media, high profile people coming out and talking about it. You know, virtually on a weekly basis now, certainly on the BBC website, you'll see some celebrities saying, oh, when this particular aspect of my life, which we all thought was difficult, oh, I now know I was going through the menopause. So, you know, there's been a couple in the last couple of weeks. So personally, as a person who keeps an eye on the news professionally, I'm just seeing it all the time. And of course, that then filters down into the public at large and awareness, and therefore people, whereas before they would have always had the symptoms. Now they're feeling a bit more confident to actually say it's due to the menopause. Yeah, my thought, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else? Hi, Jane.
Jane?
Hi, Chris. Hi, Paul. I think that it's just gaining momentum. The generational divide, if you like, it's the last taboo subject. And certainly when I was growing up, my mum and everybody around me would say it's women's problems and we don't want to talk about it. It's as simple as that. And yet I now work and have friends, you know, in their 30s who actually early menopause is onsetting, and the ability to have safe space to talk about what their symptoms are, and for lots of people to come together in lots of different social media sites. There is a huge swell around, I feel normal. I now know that it's normal as a woman. But let's not forget the guys, because actually men also have elements of menopause, which is a different terminology.
We were talking about that just earlier on, before the session. Yeah. I've a very close friend of mine. She's convinced men go through the menopause, and yeah, it's an interesting topic in itself. But yeah.
And some work that I did in a previous organisation, definitely work with London Underground Transport. Huge piece of work 4 years ago to bring that onto the manager's agenda.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Sue's put, I don't know if you've seen that, Chris. Sue's put a comment in there, which I think many women have unfortunately suffered over since they started working, really. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, Sue, but I'm not surprised, to be honest.
Yeah,
and we still hear comments to this day,
Yeah, and of course that comment from Sue there ties back to what we were just saying about the generation change. We've now had a generation of women who have been there, gone through it, and don't want that to happen to the next generation. Right, I think between sort of those discussions and what's in the chat, we've come up with sort of most of what I was thinking. These are the stats that you'll see from anybody who does one of these presentations, because they're all basically true. Menopausal women or women of menopausal age are the fastest growing demographic in the workplace. So that simply means, as we were saying, we've got more opportunity, therefore more likely to bring forwards issues about the menopause and concerns there. Collectivism tends to lead to action, I think is partly what's happening here. In much the same thread, the vast majority of women of menopausal age are in the workplace because it's 2021 and not 1971. And that goes back to sort of the point that we were just making about this generational change. A woman in her 50s or so is allowed to be in the workplace now and expected to be, and it's become socially acceptable for that to be the case. So those two are linked, and I think that is part of what we were just saying about this shift and this change. The average age is interesting. We know we were just hearing that obviously some women can start to show menopausal symptoms even as young as their 30s, but 51 is about the average. So we're talking about women born in approximately 1970, a few years either side of it. This is women who finished school in the 80s, the first generation really where the majority started to enter careers straight away from school. Grown up post-discrimination legislation and moving into senior positions as the Equality Act and general equality principles really start to take off. And of course, the important thing, as we were just saying, is they've stayed in the workplace largely, apart from, in many cases, occasional maternity breaks. Combined, I think what those things simply mean is that there are more women who are not only of menopausal age in the workplace, but are also in jobs where there is value to them in raising their own concerns. With all due respect to previous generations of women in the workplace, a middle to senior manager at a bank, a company director, a consultant, an assistant head teacher, they're all much more likely to assert their rights. That's not to say the people before shouldn't have done, but I think why it's starting to be exposed now is because we've got people in a position who are more prepared to, who have the resource to do so, and who have the motivation to do so. That shows that slight increase there in the number of cases, 5 in 2018, 6 in 2019, 16 in 2020. I don't know the stats for this year, but as Paul was just saying, I've got one. A few years ago, you'd have been astounded to find a solicitor who was dealing with one, I would have thought.
I would have think this year it would be in the several tens at least. Yeah.
It wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
And I think those bottom 3 points really summarise what came out of the discussion there. There's a combination of awareness that this can now be brought as a claim. We were talking about sex claims, age claims, and also I'll come on to disability claims. The confidence in doing so, because other people are doing so, because the support is there now. And as we were just saying, because the numbers in the workplace, simply a case of eligibility. Okay. We've already had a brief conversation about the kind of claims that might arise from discrimination issues. We mentioned age and sex. Obviously, disability is going to be in there since I spent 5 minutes at the start talking about disability. And I've included constructive dismissal on there as well. Before I dive into my thoughts on those, let's open it up again. Has anybody got any thoughts on any of those 4? I know obviously we've talked about sex and age.
Or any experiences that they don't
absolutely.
Mind, that no employees potentially raising, if you don't mind mentioning it. Maybe not.
Nope, it's not a problem. I'll just keep talking unless somebody wants to chip in, to be honest. It's my favourite thing to do. Okay, constructive dismissal I'll talk about slightly less because we know constructive dismissals are difficult claims at the best of times. But I think where they're going to arise potentially is around a failure to handle symptoms of the menopause, to treat it sensitively, but perhaps where it doesn't necessarily otherwise amount to a discrimination claim. Claimants' lawyers will generally push a stronger discrimination claim if they can, because it's much easier to run and much more worthwhile. At the end of the day, constructive dismissal claims are going to be something of a last resort, I think, in these cases, and only arise where for some reason we can't tick a discrimination box. So we'll move straight into disability claims related to the menopause. A couple of really useful cases on it. What's interesting about the menopause, both of these cases, is that the tribunals were very careful to not describe the menopause itself as a disability, but rather relied on conditions, symptoms. They're both quotes, by the way. I'm not just using those words to avoid saying anything. And that collectively, these things did start to amount to a disability in effect. I won't go into a huge amount of detail about these cases because, well, based on the statistics previously, there's only a handful of reported ones. It's the same ones that we used in every training session on the menopause, but in summary, Davies is a case of a court officer who panicked after she thought some men had drunk her diluted medication that she was taking for menopause symptoms. She was disciplined and dismissed for what the Scottish Tribunal Service referred to as knowingly misleading the men into thinking they drunk the medication. It's a really strange case because for 2018, it is one of those situations of quite literally punishing a hysterical woman. And you think we were beyond that by 2018. The Scottish Court and Tribunal Service actually agreed that the severity of her symptoms meant she was disabled. And ultimately, therefore, the tribunal upheld her disability discrimination claim and found that the dismissal was ultimately due to a symptom of her menopause. The confusion, the stress, the anxiety were all indirectly related, and that therefore the dismissal itself was discriminatory. The Daly case similarly did have to decide on disability itself, and what the ET concluded here again is rather than saying that the menopause itself is a disability, if you look at the combined effects, in her case it was largely psychological, it was a lack of concentration, memory lapses, fatigue. These all substantially impacted on her ability to remember work processes and to read and understand documents. They said that she had significant difficulty in continuing a formally active social life, was tired during the day so that she couldn't successfully sit and watch a film through the night, for example. She also had other physical conditions, difficulty carrying heavy shopping, driving long distances, and these effects had lasted at least a couple of years. So the tribunal, again, were quite happy to say here that the combined symptoms of the menopause were capable of amounting to a disability. Davies was actually a slightly unusual case, and it was a direct claim. We don't often see successful direct discrimination claims, particularly where they relate to disability. You're much more likely to see a section 15, something arising from a disability, or reasonable adjustment claims. And I think for the majority of us dealing with these, it is going to be those two that will be the ones that crop up in the future if we are ever exposed to menopause related claims. The Daly case was reasonable adjustments and something arising. Okay, another little opportunity just for a pause, because I know that's only very quick on disability, but it's more highlighting the point that the combined symptoms of the menopause, the effects, can amount to one. Any comments or thoughts on that before I move on? No. Jane?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I read both of those cases and I learned a lot. I'm just scoping a policy for the organisation, and there were things in there that I hadn't even considered. But more importantly, the connections between the type of hybrid office working that we're now starting to implement, the impact on air conditionings going on and off, the IT equipment for local fans. It's a bit wider. It just feels a little bit wider than just this direct condition and symptoms, really.
Yeah,
I thought they were great, so thank you for including them in the
yeah, they are two really good cases, and I do strongly recommend that people at least read summaries of them. I've given a very brief overview because time constraints, but yeah, as Jane says, they are very good cases on this. And absolutely highlight the concerns. As I said, direct claims are unusual in disability. But
and some of the reasonable adjustments, as Jane just hinted at as well, some of them, you know, are actually quite simple for an employer to implement, or should be, but perhaps because they're so simple, most employers still aren't really doing it, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we'll come back to that towards the end of the session. Okay. Moving on. Go on, Jane.
And just further, if we were playing that forward into a disciplinary case and the individual used that as a mitigating reason for what possibly could be considered as a gross misconduct without that disability, that needs to be taken into that band of reasonableness before potentially sacking and then going into an ET1.
Absolutely, which is almost exactly what the Davies case, as I was just saying, was about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You've got a blank screen there, Chris.
No, it's all right. I know I do. IT's great fun, isn't it? Okay, let's talk about sex and age as well. So again, exactly the same. Feel free to chip in and comment as we work through on this one as well. Okay, age claims, as we know, are generally a little bit more tricky for a claimant anyway. It's usually hard to show that something has happened as a result of their age, and even where they successfully get a direct age discrimination claim, it's the only one of the direct claims that can still be justified in law. However, they do exist. I'll start with Merchant, which was actually a sex claim. It's the oldest of these cases, but it does show, as we were saying at the start, that menopause claims have been building for a while. And I think what Merchant suggests is they would probably have been successful under the old sex discrimination legislation as well, prior to the Equality Act. Got the point. Our leading case is this one from 2012, and it did lead to one of my favourite lines in a judgment I've read for a long time, certainly during the course of the research for this, that the employer had taken a bizarre and irrational approach with other non-female related conditions. Now that absolutely sounds like a judge trying to avoid using language he wasn't comfortable with to me. But of course, what he's actually saying here is a very, very sensible point. If you were to break down the symptoms of the menopause and isolate those from the menopause itself, then we would have no problem treating them as an obvious medical condition. And what this case basically said is that if a man had gone along to BT and said, I'm suffering from A, B, C, D symptoms, it would have been treated as a serious medical problem. In this case, it was ultimately, well, that's just the menopause, was sort of BT's attitude. And that did lead to this sort of sex discrimination claim arising as a result, because fundamentally this is being treated differently because of something that is inexorably linked to sex. There's a lot of logic in that. And as I say, if you try to isolate the symptoms from the fact that it's the menopause, then we start to see the seriousness of the menopause as a medical condition. On March 2019, they were in administration by then. That's not relevant. I just felt the need to say it. But this again was about difference in treatment. Classic sort of criticism, harassment from a manager, the kind of things that we would all be advising would lead to probably a constructive dismissal anyway, even if there weren't an underlying discrimination claim. But what happened in this case, again, is the tribunal were quite happy to look at this level of bullying and harassment and say, well, no, actually, not only would you not have harassed a man in the same way as this, and therefore it must be linked to sex, but also the other female staff in the particular store in question were women but younger, and they weren't harassed in the same way and wouldn't necessarily have been. So it can also therefore be framed as an age claim, and again the claimant was successful in both sex and age here. I'm briefly going to talk about the case I'm running at the moment because we had to get an opinion from counsel early on, and their advice was actually not to run the age claim, which I thought was interesting. It's probably because our disability and sex claims are both a lot stronger, and as we said at the start, age claims can be not only difficult to plead, but also they've got that extra barrier of being justifiable, even if you do get a direct claim. But I think the importance from this is to take away that the risk is there. Okay. Right. I think that's probably it on age and sex, unless anybody's got any comments on those as well. Right, in that case, we'll move on to sort of where we were naturally going a minute ago. Let's start with practical management of workplace issues. So this really is the opportunity to chip in, share some good practice. I think what we're looking at here is two things, really. The management of menopause generally, and also strategies when issues start to escalate a little bit, or to prevent them escalating to the extent we've seen in the sort of the 4 cases that I've discussed there. I'll run through the bullet points in a second, but again, opportunity to chip in, opportunity to give thoughts. But my first question is going to be, how many people have a menopause policy? If we could do that by hands up or a wave if you're on camera or something along those lines, or just a yes or no in the chat box, whatever. How many people have got a menopause policy? Or is anybody going to admit to having one?
Very few, I would say.
I agree. Yeah, I'm getting a lot of no's, a couple
In
of
draft,
drafts.
yeah. And Jane's already said that they're looking at,
Yeah. Okay. Does anybody actually have one? I'm getting a lot of no's.
Like...
Is there anybody who's going to say yes? Or is there anybody who wants to tell me why they don't have one? Doing a guidance piece, yeah. Okay. I mean, I'll give my opinion on it in a second. Yeah, no, lots of no's and a few workings on it. Fine. I think the company is scared. Interesting. Okay. Right. Okay. Controversial comment, Simon. I know there's a couple of people who will be familiar with my views on things like this. I'm not a fan of pointed or specific policies as a general rule.
We both say that, don't we? You don't have policies just for the sake of it.
Yeah. So I think absolutely, and I think some of the comments coming through are going to be along those sorts of lines. I find very specific policies like this tend to be blankets, tend to be a little bit authoritarian in nature, and more importantly, tend to sit in a cupboard unread, because nobody reads these kind of policies until there's a problem. Policies don't prevent problems if they're not followed, if they're not read, and if they're not listened to. We will all have dealt with cases where there's a discrimination tribunal going on. There's a policy in the bundle. Well, it didn't prevent the claim, it didn't prevent the situation that led to the claim, and there is a risk that it will also have added to the claim as a failure to follow the policy in the first place.
Quite common, yeah.
I always put it in, the moment there's a policy there that hasn't been followed properly, then you argue that it's discriminatory not to have followed the policy if you can, because why not?
Jane, sorry, just to interrupt, Chris, Jane said, could we add it into family friendly? You put that, either standalone policy or you could put it in that suite, couldn't you? Bearing in mind it is.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm not going to criticise people who want to have them. If you're the kind of institution that has these policies where it's going to be followed correctly, and I think where it's drafted well, but I do think there are better ways to manage the vast majority of workplace issues than to just have a policy on them.
Yeah, training and communications.
Well, yeah,
more important. Yeah.
Hence my 5 points on the screen here. And again, I think we can probably talk around some of these. So again, I'll run through these. If people want to chip in at any time, again, as always, be my guest. So I've put communicate on there. This starts with us as employers. You need to be clear that you're an organisation who is willing and able to discuss any problem in the workplace and to create a culture where women in relation to the menopause, or indeed, as we said earlier, men who are having similar issues, or perhaps have a partner who's going through the menopause and it's affecting them, I feel able, to talk about their experiences if they need support, and to be comfortable talking to whether that's a line manager or HR. Obviously, at the same time, this is about respecting boundaries. Not everyone is open and sharing kind of person who wants to talk about what is ultimately a private medical issue at work and with their colleagues. So that openness needs to be encouraged by us as businesses, but with that expectation that ultimately it'll be up to the employee to bring the issue forward and to raise it. And as we always say in discrimination cases, we don't want to hand them the idea, let them raise it. Within respecting boundaries and privacy, of course, let's not forget there is a data protection point here. Somebody going through the menopause, that is medical data, so just make sure that that's being respected. Medical assessments and occupational health. I think this is about knowing when you actually need to undertake these and when it's overkill. An individual assessment for every menopausal individual is going to be disproportionate, but can you undertake a general review of the workplace? It's actually, I think, somewhat comparable to where we were with the COVID risks initially. You're identifying situations in your workplace where someone suffering from one of these potential symptoms could be at a disadvantage or facing a problem, and then asking ourselves how we can make that situation better for that individual, how we can mitigate that disadvantage. Occupational health, I think, is probably only going to be relevant where somebody where either you're talking about this as a sickness absence procedure or somebody raises it as a disability. I don't think occupational health is necessarily going to be needed to be involved too early in these situations.
Yeah, I'll cover that
yeah.
a little bit later with
yeah,
non-coded.
Absolutely. I've put workplace adjustments there. Let's briefly say reasonable adjustments, which is obviously only going to apply where this individual might be disabled in law. That said, and we already started to hint at this, and I think this is where we really will start to get some ideas, and I'm hoping people are going to have more experience in this than I am. Relatively simple things are going to qualify as adjustments, and mostly, as they often are with disability cases as well, reasonable adjustments are often common sense alterations. It's easy to laugh at kind of the cliche of turning down the AC a degree or two, or distributing fans or whatever, but they do actually help. If you have a culture which recognises that people need space away from their desks for a little while, then the fact that that's extended to somebody who's going through the menopause and needs that time shouldn't be an issue. And therefore you shouldn't need a policy that says somebody experiencing the symptoms of the menopause is allowed to walk away from their desk. The culture is already there. And lastly, educate. Doing sessions like this, talking. Most discrimination comes from ignorance. Whether that's hate in the form of racism, fear in transphobia, or a lack of understanding in these menopause cases, it is where discrimination claims ultimately arise from. The more people understand something, know about something, and are familiar with something, generally speaking, the better they react to it. So that's my thoughts on practical management. I think it is a lot of common sense, a lot of talking, a lot of culture rather than imposing things. But I am welcome to hearing from other people if they've got comments or ideas or experiences.
Yeah, before we move on, because I think that's your last bit, isn't it, Chris? So before we move on from the menopause, has anyone got any comments, questions, or anything relating to that? No. Okay.
Hi, Pam.
Okay. Thanks, Chris.
No, Paul, I've got Pem's just joined on. Yeah, go on, Pem.
I missed that. Sorry, Pem.
No, don't worry. Hello, both. I obviously, Chris knows my views on some of this as well. I really do think it's around the education piece and less around policy, as you've already mentioned. The other area that I think we do need to be mindful of is around individuals not actually knowing that they're going through that process or those symptoms or those conditions, because some of the conditions are very similar to others. And it's that having to accept that you're going through those through those symptoms and reaching out and getting help. As employers and as HR and as legal, we are not professionals, and it's around signposting so that individuals may be able to recognise them and then reach out for help. And it's providing those tools so that they can reach out and actually find out if those are the right symptoms, because so often you go down a separate line because you're unaware, and ignorance I get, and as we said, it's around education, but those individuals may not be aware, and that whole constructive dismissal or discrimination comes further down the line, not at the start of a process. So I think that there is an element or a gap that's missing as part of an education piece and supporting from an employer point of view as well. Sorry.
No, I absolutely agree.
Point.
Let's not forget this is an issue that's going to affect the majority of 50% of the population. This isn't sort of an isolated, unusual medical condition. I think I agree. I think there is an element of ensuring perhaps that the symptoms are recognisable and then knowing how to signpost at the appropriate time.
Yeah, and the other part of it, which I'm coming across more often, is as females, we're very, very happy. There's a big group of us to talk about things, whereas men aren't. As we mentioned, there are symptoms from both sides that potentially will lead, and there are other medical conditions that currently we don't talk about, which will at some point be publicised, will be more advanced from a medical point of view as well, and then we'll be able to talk about it. So I think it's great that we are talking about the menopause, but we must remember as employers that there are other symptoms, there are other individuals within the business that are silent and suffering, and we need to be able to support them as well. I'm going to stop now.
No, that's great. Thanks, Peb. I mean, unless anybody's got anything else, then talking about other medical conditions seems to segue quite nicely for you, Paul.
Yeah, and funny enough, that's one of my first points, which I'll make clear in a minute. But any other questions or comments on the menopause?
Yeah, there's just one question that's gone up in the chat there. I would say we can either ask that openly, or people can feel free to respond to it in the chat. Steps people have taken to raise awareness so far. If anybody wants to chip in, again, feel free, or if not, again, feel free to answer.
Has anyone actually undertaken any sort of training, brought any sort of external people in? As I said, Chris and I struggle to get an expert talk because they're all so busy, so they're obviously talking to a lot of people. Just wondered if anyone else has done that. No. Be interesting to see as we go on if people are doing it. Okay, shall we? Oh, Sue, training to become an educator in this field.
Excellent.
There you go. Look forward to seeing how you get on, Sue. Okay, well, obviously, we can still, if any questions or comments arise out of the menopause bit, that can come up. And as Chris just said, it kind of links into my bit. Thanks, Chris, for that. So if we can go on to the next one. So my session is going to be broken down basically into two. It probably won't be quite so long because unlike what Chris had, I don't actually have any cases really on long COVID because, of course, they haven't gone through the tribunal system yet, although I'm sure there will be some. And the first thing I wanted to point, and this links back to what we were just saying about symptoms, is you may be aware the NHS has set out, as it says on the slide there, a comprehensive list of symptoms. And there's about, getting on for 15 they've got on here. But if I just read a few of them out, some of them might sound familiar when we were just talking about the menopause. Extreme tiredness, fatigue, problems with memory and concentration, open bracket, brain fog, difficulty sleeping, depression and anxiety, tinnitus and earaches. That's just 4 or 5 there. I think, from my knowledge of researching the menopause, they are exactly some of the symptoms that you get with the menopause as well. And so it links back to what Chris was saying earlier about diagnosis and how you don't have to have a diagnosis to have a disability. Obviously, long COVID, some of the symptoms are very, very similar to what we've been talking about. And research is obviously still ongoing. So this is a fairly new thing pretty much this year. So obviously the pandemic hit last year. Research, long COVID wasn't known about, obviously because they had to wait several months to see what was happening until towards the end of last year. And so really it's only this year that the research has been kicking forward. And the last sort of main study was back in July that I found. And the good news is that long COVID is less common than first feared. So in the previous sort of research done early in the year, they feared that as many as 1 in 10 people suffered from long COVID. Whereas now, and by long COVID, the kind of definition is those symptoms I just went through, and as I say, there's a lot more, there's another sort of 10 or so, but lasts more than 3 months. That's the kind of definition they're using. And they now think it's not 1 in 10, it's nearer to 1 in 40. So not quite as bad, but still, you know, the many thousands of us who have had COVID, you know, 2.5% of those people, that's still going to be many thousands of people across the country who will suffer from long COVID. But of course, importantly, they may not be diagnosed with it. Now, interestingly, the researcher showed the most likely group, and again, this kind of links back to menopause, are women between the age of 50 and 69. So again, we're almost the same bracket as the menopause that we've just been speaking about. That's been found to be the most likely people who do go on to get long COVID, unfortunately. The way the research is showing into long COVID, because it's such a new thing, the problem is that there's no test for long COVID. It's really an elimination process. So what a doctor will do, from what my understanding is, they will literally do blood tests for other things, do tests, and they will eliminate everything else. Only when they can't find any other cause for all these symptoms, they will go, oh, we think you've got long COVID, assuming you've just had COVID in the last several months. Interestingly, there doesn't appear to be a link between how bad you have COVID initially to whether you go on and get long COVID. So you might be really ill in the early weeks of having COVID. And obviously the vaccinations will have changed this a bit, because hopefully people will get more mild symptoms than they would have done. But just because you get severe symptoms early on doesn't necessarily mean you'll go on to get long COVID. And similarly, there are many people who are getting mild symptoms, but unfortunately then develop long COVID going forward. So there doesn't seem to be a correlation between the two. So really, the first thing to say when you've linking it back to us in the workplace is you may have people off sick or at least coming into work with some of these symptoms, but it won't be diagnosed at that stage. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be, one, looking out for it, being aware, and two, treating it as a potential disability, because again, some of those symptoms, memory loss, depression, anxiety, things like that, extreme tiredness are going to be, and if we go on to the next slide, Chris, it all links back to the definition that Chris put up earlier. They can be substantial and obviously being long COVID, last for a long time. So it can be that they're suffering for 12 months. Some people, now we've had the pandemic for nearly 2 years. There are people out there who contracted COVID in 2020 and are still suffering all this time onwards. But of course, as the definition says, is likely to last 12 months. And because there's no research that has defined how long you're going to have long COVID for, again, it's better to be safe than sorry and treat those people as if they may be disabled under the Equality Act, and therefore linking back to some of the stuff that we've talked about already, and I'll come on to again in a minute, about how you deal with that. So I'm not going to go, has anyone got any questions on long COVID or any experiences that may have staff at work at the moment who they think may have long COVID, if they don't mind saying, or because obviously it's a fairly new thing, and very similar, as I say, to the menopause in terms of some of the symptoms, perhaps. But has anyone got any comments or questions on that? Ellen from the NHS. Oh, that's interesting. So you've got different pay. I don't know if everyone can see that in the comment, but Ellen's saying that those people with post-COVID syndrome, as it can be called, are still in receipt of full pay, in some cases over a year later, and in contrast of long-term sick for other conditions who are entitled to a maximum 6 months full pay. I don't know, Ellen, is that because they are still trying to come into work, or are they off on long-term sick as well? Because if they are off on sick, then I would have thought they should have been treated pay-wise the same as anyone else who's off on long-term sick. And indeed, and I had this myself personally only a couple of weeks ago, one adjustment that the tribunals have consistently said, sorry, Ellen, I'll let you come. I'm just making the point about the pay. The thing they've consistently said that isn't necessarily reasonable adjustment is to those people with disabilities have more favourable treatment as far as pay. So, for example, if someone, because of their disability, has to drop down to a lower job or less hours and all that, their pay shouldn't necessarily be protected. Sorry, Ellen. So yeah, what's the situation?
Yeah, so it's a difficult one really, in that we are supporting staff obviously with long-term sickness issues, across the board really. And in relation to post-COVID or long COVID, we're in the position where we have people often a small number now of people that have been off for a significant period, but sort of each NHS organisation is treating them differently. So there might be slightly different rules at play in terms of each individual NHS trust, and I don't think there's many cases yet at all, sort of nationally, where staff have reached a dismissal stage for long-term sickness due to COVID. So we're in a position where actually we have staff on full sick pay entitlements, sort of indefinitely, really, at the moment. I'm obviously working through those cases with those individuals, but obviously there's a rub there for those staff that have other conditions that are equally significant and severe, and obviously, dropping to a different level of pay entitlement for sickness. So it's it's a bit of an ongoing issue that we're working through, and doesn't sit well, I think, at the moment for us.
No,
just working through those issues.
Yeah, that's interesting, because obviously dismissal and pay are two separate things. So I can understand at the moment perhaps not looking at dismissal, because of course, again, we don't know how long they're going to be off for. So even if you send them to occupational health, or for example, and is this person likely to return to work soon, or with or without adjustments, it's very difficult perhaps to say. But that's different from pay. I don't understand personally, but I can see why, because NHS is obviously many different trusts and therefore many different employers per se, albeit under the umbrella of the NHS. Why they're being treated differently for pay, because obviously, yes, perhaps not dismiss them, but they could still be treated the same as anyone else off on long-term sick as far as pay is concerned. Do you just think it's some sort of administration across the different trusts that's causing that?
Yeah, I think the national guidance has been a little bit lacking in this area, certainly in terms of that sort of consistent approach, really. And absolutely, we're keen to sort of understand exactly what's expected of us each as organisations. I think the challenge has been to support the staff, obviously fundamentally in terms of their individual circumstances, work with those people where we can in terms of supporting a return to work. Obviously, remembering a lot of these are clinical. So when we talk about the symptoms of fatigue and brain fog and all of those things, they're not conducive to working in a clinical environment, and we're limited to how well we can redeploy those staff to other areas as well. So it is an ongoing battle. I understand there are some trade union negotiations ongoing with regard to the pay element, and we're waiting for an outcome really as to that at the moment.
You've got that aspect as well. Yeah, you've got the union angle as well, which I appreciate is another dimension totally.
An ongoing challenge. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you. That's interesting. That's interesting to no, and I've put back on this. We've put on this slide here again, identifying long COVID, because where this is different to even the menopause, although the menopause has become a fairly new topic in terms of awareness and being talked about openly at work. Obviously, research into it has been going on for, I'd hope, many years. Appreciate it. Whereas long COVID is only, obviously, it wasn't a word 18 months ago. So it's very difficult from the medical side of things. But of course, we've got to remember as employers, whilst ultimately you're the one who makes the decision on reasonable adjustments, you're not going to be medical experts, and that you can only be driven by what the doctors and medical research are saying. But ultimately, what you've got to look at, and Ellen just touched on this, is the reasonable adjustment side of things. If you're saying that obviously they can't work in a clinical environment with some of the symptoms, unfortunately, because I can see it'd be probably dangerous for a start. So that's what you've got to focus on. What are the reasonable adjustments in my particular workplace, bearing in mind the symptoms that they've got. And as I say, yes, it may be that they can't work and you can't redeploy them or anything, which, subject to any more comments or questions, brings me nicely onto the next slide, I think, Chris, which is talking about sickness absence and capability in a little bit more general. Any more thoughts on long COVID? I'm conscious we're nearly an hour in already, so we thought that this bit would probably be fairly quick because we've covered sickness absence and that many times. But Pam, you've come back on.
I have. I have a occupational health specialist within my network, and one of the things that she flagged up is that long COVID can occur 3 to 6 months after an individual has been exposed to COVID. So we wouldn't necessarily, as professionals, link it automatically. So it's just something to flag up.
Yes, no, thank you. Yes, good. Yeah, because you think, well, how can it be COVID? You had that last year or beginning of the year. I can understand that. Although that is quite worrying that long COVID can develop several months on. No, that's a good point. So sickness absence, just to remind, these are just some general principles that we put down that I just want to remind people of. And this is going to be for the menopause, long COVID, anyone really who's off sick. So obviously, short-term, long-term, there is no legal definition for these, but what we tend to run on is a 4-week period. So if someone's off for less than 4 weeks, then deemed to be short-term. If it's once it gets to 4 weeks, then it's long-term absence. And indeed, in many contracts and policies, you will see 4 weeks used as a sort of benchmark. What we do find, and a lot of you who've known me over the years have probably heard me say this many times before, where employers still go wrong, I think, is they will leave it far too long. And just literally, as soon as someone goes off sick, if it's with a condition that you think is very likely to be long-term, which obviously long COVID could well be, and the menopause, then you should be acting, even if it is just in support and communication and that, from day one. Obviously, you won't be taking any sort of capability action from day one, but you've got to plan ahead. And the amount of employers who I talk to, how long have they been off for? 6 months. And so what have you done to actively manage? Oh, well, we've just, we've left them. We didn't want to, harass them or anything, so we've just left it. We're not paying them contractual sick pay anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But of course, there is both a financial and employee relationship cost in doing it like that. So that's something to think of. We've got on here capability and conduct. Obviously, it would be very rare where conduct would be an issue. Where it might be is obviously if you do genuinely think that, and we've got this on the next slide about a malingerer, someone who's chancing it. So, they're in the huge minority, I would hope, but we do know there are a few people out there who will try and play the system. And of course, long COVID is now something else that they can sort of use as a badge. I'm ill, I've got to take time off. Got to be careful. You've got to do your usual checks and everything. Get occupational health report potentially. Keeping in touch, return to work interviews, which are coming on to all that in a second. But basically, you need to actively manage that and be careful. But ultimately, if you do think someone is chancing it, malingering, then take action. Having said that we don't like policies, obviously sickness is one policy that along with a few others like disciplinary agreements that you should have. It is such a basic thing. And your policy, I think, should have a few key things in it as part of a capability process. So the first thing is you want to say that you have the right to ask the employee regarding the medical report. Access to Medical Report Act obviously gives them some rights around that, including they have to give consent and they're entitled to a copy of it before you receive it. But ultimately, you can put in a contract that it's a contractual obligation on them. In certain situations, for example, if they've been off work for at least 4 weeks, that you can get a medical report on them. And that could be very important in cases such as menopause and long COVID, whereby you don't necessarily know what's wrong with them. You know, they tell you the symptoms perhaps, and they may not tell you all the symptoms, but you don't actually know what the diagnosis is at this stage. With both of these, it could take many months before they actually get a diagnosis. So it's probably important to get a report in those cases, and you will obviously want to ask the appropriate questions around that. And again, that's something I'm sure Chris sees it as well. I see is employers ask for medical reports or get an occupational health report, but they don't ask the right questions. And therefore the report they get back is often pretty useless, particularly asking, you've probably heard this before, many of you as well, but GP reports generally aren't very helpful. They tend to focus on the medical side and not on the occupational reasonable adjustment side. There are exceptions, but generally you want to, as Pen mentioned, she's got an occupational health contact. We've known several over the years. It's best to use someone like that. And obviously some of the large organisations will have internal occupational health anyway. If we can just go on to the next slide, please, Chris. I just want to. So some of the stuff I've just saying I've said there. The other thing I would look at in general sickness absence around this, and again I'm conscious I don't want to speak too long about this, is the other thing, going back to the staff chancing it, diagnosis is communication, regular contact, keep in touch with those people off with these symptoms, and if they do come back to work, doing return to work interviews. I think it's absolutely key in these situations. Those return to working, I know it sounds quite a minor thing, but actually if someone knows that they're going to be, even in a nice way, questioned when they come back to work, statistically it's shown they are a lot less likely to make something up or chance it. Similarly, keeping in touch, that's going to help you with identifying and ultimately, yes, you can't diagnose their condition, but you're much more likely to find out sooner about what's wrong with them, and therefore being able to deal with it. Having said that, repeated thing we've said several times today, diagnosis isn't the golden egg. You don't need a diagnosis to be able to either treat them properly or indeed discriminate against them. The one thing I would say in terms of discrimination claims, obviously the disability one is going to be key here. From the research, possibly an indirect sex, although it's much weaker. But if it was shown that women are much more likely as we go forward to get long COVID, it could be a possibility. But disability is the one here. And again, age probably not, because as we know, long COVID, and indeed apparently it looks like certainly in young children, whereas they don't get the symptoms, statistically I've been reading that they are one of the groups that do get some sort of long COVID for a few months afterwards as well. So age is probably not likely thing. Go on to the next slide, please, Chris. Finally, remote management. We've talked about this before in sessions, and it's already been mentioned today about hybrid working from home. Obviously, that brings its own challenges as far as monitoring, communicating, keeping in touch with people. Oh, thank you. Sue's just put in a contact there if anyone wants to make a note of that. Anna Harrington as an occupational health specialist. Thanks, Sue. Yes, so going back to remote management, its own challenges when people are working from home. But basically, it's the same things you need to do. Chris and I have talked about this before. We're not into Big Brother monitoring keyboard strokes and cameras on monitoring people. It should be a bit more sophisticated than that, but is essential as well in terms of monitoring how people are, I do think there is the issue where people working from home, they may have some of these symptoms, but of course, because you're not seeing them day to day, if they don't raise them, their performance might dip, but you might not necessarily know the reason why. And it could be it could be because they're suffering from some of these symptoms that we've talked about today in both long COVID and menopause. And so it does add to its own challenge. And I think in this day and age of working from home, hybrid working, you do need to be even more aware of keeping in touch with people, monitoring them in a, dare I say it, better way in terms of face-to-face, even if it's over video or telephone calls, getting them to report back, monitoring the actual work output that's been done. And I appreciate some jobs are easier to monitor than others on that point, but rather than Big Brother. Chris, have you got any? I've whizzed through my bit because I'm conscious we're well over the hour. Have you got any comments to make?
No, I think I'd maybe only add in there that you've potentially got where people are working from home, the two extremes as well. People who are maybe less likely to take a bed day off because the work is just there, but at the same time, you've talked about chances, people where it's a lot easier to just stay in bed as well. And I think that plays into this as well and is worth keeping in mind, and that is part of the monitoring and management.
Mm-hmm. So any more questions or final comments or even, dare I say, feedback for future sessions? Anyone wants to put in the chat or raise by unmuting now? No? Okay, well, just goes to say thank you so much for joining us today. As I say, we will be looking, our next session, unless something amazing happens in the employment law world. Well, sorry, Joe's just come on. Should COVID no longer COVID absences be included for absence management? Yes, is the short answer, Joe. It should be added in as a potential thing for absence management. But as I say, it's looking at the symptoms that is the main thing, and obviously the list of symptoms is exactly the same as a lot of other things. Thanks for all the kind words that are coming through on the chat. I was going to say our next session, unless something amazing happens, will be our usual first of the year one, which will be looking back on cases this year, but also looking forward at the big topics going forward. That will be in February. Again, really appreciate if people could let us know in the feedback whether they will like to do face-to-face. As I said, we're going to carry on with virtual ones, but it would be nice to do face-to-face for those of you fortunate enough to be able to come. And yeah, so if you can perhaps feedback on that, that would be great, because obviously if we don't get the numbers, we simply will stay online. Personally, and I know Chris, I believe, feels the same, we like doing the face-to-face ones. It also gives those of you that can make it the opportunity to share ideas, talk across, network. So it would be good if we can do those going forward, but obviously it will depend also on the pandemic as well. Right, Pem, just final comments before I let you go. Pem has just said, how about getting Anna to support on a session in regard to long COVID OC support? Certainly, if that's something people would be interested in, getting an occupational health sort of view on it, that would be great. Getting one comment there about face-to-face as well. Yeah, as I say, we'd like to do that, but we'll see. But yes, thanks, Pem. It could be, if people would like to feedback on that as well, if that would be something you'd be interested in, then we could look at that for next year. Any closing comments, Chris? Otherwise, I'll let everyone go.
No, I think that's just about it. Thank you to everybody who contributed. Of course, it does make the session a lot easier, like I said, and it is nice to keep the interaction up.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a good day, and hopefully speak and see some of you soon. Take care.